How does one make a sword that looks like it's made out of water in real life? Well, that is exactly what I set out to do when I decided to make Tidus from Final Fantasy X for ColossalCon this year. Drumroll, please! I've teased it enough on socials, the video you've been asking for, maybe. How I made Tidus' Brotherhood Sword from Final Fantasy X. While I was carrying this sword around at ColossalCon, I had a ton of people come up to me and ask how I made it, which I just simply could not answer that question in any reasonable amount of time. So if you're one of those folks that asked me how I made it, welcome. I'm glad you found me. I've spoken quite a bit about how much I dislike making props and armor, anything that involves sanding and painting, really. I just find that my skills are better suited to sewing, and I find prop work just very stressful and rewarding, sure, but headache-inducing, to say the least. Spoiler alert, this sword was no different from that experience. However, with this being a competition build, I really wanted to make sure I put in the work for this one. I wanted to make the sword look as professional as possible, and because a prop of any kind doesn't put me in far enough over my head as it is, I really wanted to try as hard as I could to make this blade look like water like it does in the game, which entails it being more or less transparent. Molding and casting. This is a technique that has haunted me for pretty much the entire length of my cosplay career. The industry standard technique of making a prototype, making a mold out of silicone, then casting and resin to make a polished, more or less easily paintable version. And with me wanting a level of transparency for this blade, my only option was really to use clear epoxy resin. So issue 1 was the prototype. I already had the 3D file that I purchased, so I sent that off to get printed because all of my locally available printers were way too small for something of this size unless I wanted to wait months. And I didn't have months. I had about 3 months to make the entire costume start to finish, so that wasn't gonna fly. Now, yes, 3D modeling isn't the most praised technique to use in craftsmanship due to it mostly being seen as the easy way out to make 3D objects, so I figured because I'm only using it as a master for this prop, it would be permissible. Also, I have no talent for 3D sculpting in real life. I have to make patterns after pattern after pattern, and then refine, and then sand, and then I can't do it. I can't do it. Unfortunately, even though you're making a mold and casting it out of something else, you do have to assemble and prepare your print just like you were going to paint it for real. Because if you don't, your cast is still gonna have all the texture lines from the 3D print, as well as all the seams, which you can fix after it's done, but I really didn't want to do that, especially not on clear resin, because of how polished it needs to be to maintain that transparency. If you need a guide on how to finish 3D prints, I am no role model, you shouldn't look at me. My only advice is to buy a couple cans of filler primer, a tube of Bondo, and a variety pack of sandpaper. To gloss over about 6 hours of gluing and sanding, here we are. I hit my sword with a layer of crystal clear to seal in all the particles, and then we are ready for the fun part. Fun. That fun part being making our mold. I kid you not, there is not one way to do this. There's like tons of ways you can make a mold, but this is what I have found to be what's done most often in my research. My first step was basically making the second half of my mold out of a layer of clay. This is so that the first layer of silicone has a sort of surface to make the first half of the mold with, if that makes sense. Now the industry standard is to use an oil-based clay called clean clay because it doesn't air dry, so it's reusable, and it's easy to remove, and it doesn't contain any sulfur, which would react with your silicone and keep it from curing correctly. However, they don't make this clay anymore. But luckily for me, and maybe for you if you're going to attempt this too, Michaels actually sells a dupe of this in a much smaller size than I actually need. So, what did I do? I went to my local Michaels and I cleaned them out. And some of that was on clearance too, so not bad. It did turn out to actually be cheaper than what it would have been if I had bought the original product, so nice. For the base of my mold blocks, I'm using a sheet of foam core, which is basically that science fair presentation board, and unceremoniously slapping full handfuls of that clay down. It might be helpful to nestle your prop in the middle and then build up the clay around it. All you're trying to do is keep the silicone from seeping underneath it, so it's important to get right up against the edges and to smooth everything out as best as you can. I did not do that great of a job. I found it was easiest to get a bucket of warm water and then drop the clay still in the wrappers in the bucket so it would soften. Otherwise, I'd have to knead all that clay by hand to get it to warm up, and that was just gonna be way too much, especially my poor fingers, So I don't know why I thought this was gonna be some like fairly quick process, but no. I sat on my living room floor for probably 3 hours doing this. Now is also a good time to add a sprue to your mold with your clay. A sprue is the channel where you pour your resin in and it lets air bubbles escape too. If it's too small, resin might not fully fill up the mold, or you'll trap excess air bubbles. And with all the inverted parts of the sword, especially with that fish hook part of the blade, that was especially important to include in this. I ended up doing one at either end. The next step is to build the walls of the mold box. You can really use anything you have, like wood, EVA foam, but I'm going ahead with more pieces of that foam core board. The last step before getting ready to pour your silicone is to poke some holes in your clay around the perimeter of your prototype. This creates keys, little interlocking shapes that make sure your mold halves line up perfectly when you're ready to cast. Oh, and one more thing. Do not forget to spray a layer of mold release. Just do it, don't skip it. Do 2 layers, do 3 layers, it will help you out. Silicone likes to stick to everything unless it's super shiny and glossy, so please, for the love of God, don't forget this. Now we can crack open our silicone. The easiest way I found to determine how much you need is to measure the dimensions of your mold box, length and width, and then the height from the layer of clay to at least 3/4 of an inch above your prop. Just like in 4th grade math class, you're going to multiply length times width times height to find the volume of your first half. And to accommodate the volume of the prototype, I took 60% of that measurement, and then doing a quick Google search, I converted my cubic inches to ounces. Mix up that much of your 2-part silicone, and then mix it together, and that should be just about how much you need, plus a little extra. Extra doesn't hurt. And this is when everything started to go wrong. This could not be going more wrong than it already is. So for starters, my mold is certainly leaking, as I've tried to combat here. And I clearly don't have enough silicone, in case you didn't notice the, I don't know what turn of phrase to use for that, but I don't have enough silicone. And also, the sword is floating. The silicone is making it float in here. We're gonna try and plug some leaks that are still happening over here, and, this isn't going well.
The next day.
Hello. It is another new day, and, we all saw what was happening over here yesterday. My mold box was not watertight, so it started to leak, and I lost quite a bit of silicone out of that. However, not all is lost, because when I do fill it up again, I can just chop up these pieces and add it in for, like, filler, pretty much, which is nice. You can definitely see the wood grain pattern from my floor in it, which is cool. But going forward, we're going to rethink things a little bit. So I'm going to try and cut out some pieces, make the mold smaller. That's the game plan. Wish me luck. Thank God I used my tax return on this silicone, because otherwise I'd be capital B broke. So I ordered more silicone and cut away a lot of the extra negative space in the mold to reduce how much I need. So this pour went much better. Still some leakage, but definitely not as bad as the first time. This sat for a few hours to cure, and then the mold box walls were taken apart and the mold was flipped over to expose the clay on top. Demolding this was, fun. I had quite a bit of seepage to cut away from under the print after I flipped the mold over, even though I tried really hard to prevent that from happening with the clay. But that just meant I had more offcuts to use as fluff. Don't forget to make sure that your sprue lines are big enough still, and to put another layer of mold release over your silicone, or else it'll stick together before pouring your second half. We had a little more leakage, but again, not as bad as the first time. Nothing was as bad as that first time. All there was to do was wait for it to cure and then separate the 2 halves. I'm not gonna lie, when I put this into, this mold wasn't the prettiest. I had little bits of clay everywhere, and my join lines were the furthest thing from even. This was gonna have to work though, because I was not about to drop the better part of $1,000 in more silicone. And do that again. Before we were ready to cast, I slapped my mold halves together, sandwiched them between wooden boards, and then used ratchet straps, yes, that's actually what they're called, to tighten everything up. Putting the wooden boards on either side helps keep the silicone mold from bulging or warping during the pour, and the straps add even pressure across the whole mold so resin doesn't leak out the sides. Well, that was the idea anyways. Are you seeing a theme here? It's important to mention that I made one side of my mold entirely flat so I could sit it up on its side when I was casting. Then it was finally time to mix up my resin, stirring in a little blue pigment to give it that ocean blue color. I really couldn't have done this pouring process without some help, so I enlisted the help of my friend Lynn to tackle pouring into the other sprue while I poured the handle end. This pour was much less eventful than the silicone fiasco, thankfully. We still had some leakage, but definitely not as catastrophic. Unmolding was actually really hard, but once that top half was separated, lifting out the resin cast was smooth sailing. Overall, I had a lot of what was called flash on the edges to sand away, plenty of bubbles to fill, and lots of general unevenness to correct. I was able to slice away the thinner pieces pretty easily, but the majority of the sanding was done using a low grit disc on my orbital sander. This thing literally made this build possible. The larger surface area compared to that of like a Dremel, for example, really helps getting those clean sweeping lines so much easier. There is no way I could have gotten this thing nearly as smooth if I had to do it all by hand. It makes me a little sick to my stomach with how quickly I'm blowing through the sanding process, but truthfully, there's not much to say about it. I probably spent about 8 hours alone sanding, which isn't the worst, truth be told. Now this thing was looking pretty matte so far, and I really wanted it to look glossy like water. So to bring back the transparent effect of the blade, I opted to take a note from Resin Ocean tables and did a pour of rapid cure resin. To do this, I stood the sword up on 2 paint caps to get it off the ground, and then I just poured an even layer of clear over the entire blade. What I had left over, I mixed with white pigment, and then drizzled that on top in no particular pattern. The trick with this technique to avoid a runny mess is to let your resin kick or start to set so it doesn't just flow off your blade and make a runny mess all over your floor. And then I was able to use my heat gun to spread out the white layer, which creates that foamy ocean wave effect. Okay, now look at that. So because the bubbles at the base of the sword didn't end up casting too well, I pulled out what was left of my Worbla's crystal art, which is a thermoplastic just like normal Worbla, but instead of sheets, it comes in little beads. Now this stuff gets hot. So much so, I had to put on a pair of gardening gloves to roll the material into bubbles, placing them as organically as I could over the molded bubble shapes in the sword. For reference, handling this stuff with your bare hands feels like when you get hot glue directly on your skin. Not my favorite. To really blend the Worbla into the resin, I mixed a little of my UV resin with some of the white pigment I used for the top coat, and then drizzled it between the bubbles to look like they're foaming out of the blade. Thankfully for me, painting this thing was generally unremarkable, aside from the hellish masking experience which is typical for most fantasy prop designs. We started off with a glossy black base coat, moving forward to silver, then turquoise, adding a slight gradient with my airbrush using a darker pearlized blue, and then finally doing some finishing work by hand to touch up any imperfections and paint on small details. The grip gets wrapped in some faux leather from my stash, using a ladder stitch to close it up along the side. Over top of that, I did a traditional katana wrap using Japanese sageo cord. Now this was really hard to get right, and definitely took some trial and error. I'll link the diagram I used below. Basically, it's starting with a loop, wrapping, twisting, overlapping, and repeating until you reach the bottom. All that was left after that was to tie on the scarf and the braided cord details. And ladies and gents, they thems of the apocalypse, the Brotherhood Sword was finished. While prop work certainly isn't everything in a cosplay competition, I felt like this was really the make or break part of this build for Tidus. I learned so much from doing this. I practiced with materials I never dreamed I would use on this scale, and playing with transparency was a lot of fun too. Now, I might be biased, but I think this is one of the best props I've ever made in my career so far. Was this the cheapest way to do it? Absolutely not. But at the end of the day, getting to walk around the con with what looks like a giant blue raspberry lollipop was so worth it. I tried to keep this video as thorough as I possibly could without making it a full-length documentary. If you did survive all the way through the end of this, You're an absolute legend. If you have any questions or just want to say hi, feel free to leave a comment below or DM me on any of my socials at Jackarufu. I couldn't have done this build without referencing the works of people who came before me, so a special thanks to Crash Candy Cosplay and Sir Franku, who have also made this prop before and turned out absolutely gorgeous when they made it too. They both attempted a resin casted beast very similar to me. Their resources very much guided my plan of attack on this too. If you liked the video, make sure you hit that like button and maybe drop a subscribe if you're feeling nasty. It really helps me out and keeps me motivated to post more of these because I do have some more videos for Tidus down the pipeline, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, keep building, keep experimenting. Whatever that crazy project you want to work on is, you can do it. I believe in you. But maybe try and do it without spilling 6 gallons of silicone on your floor. Bye.